The nation is at war in two countries right now, largely because of the threat of terrorism. But not all terrorism comes from overseas. Law enforcement in this nation very vigilant about the threat of homegrown terror. It becomes an even more evident threat after the news about the FBI and New York police breaking up a plot to blow up two New York synagogues and shoot down U.S. military planes. The four suspects in custody allegedly became radicalized not overseas, but right here while doing time in prison. So how serious is the threat and what can we do about it? Let's bring in Steve Emerson. He is the executive director of the investigative project. He is also the author of Jihad Incorporated. Steve, outside the book, you had an opinion piece in one of the newspapers, one of the New York newspapers, that had a couple of quotes that I thought were interesting. You were talking about what you see as the folly of bringing Guantanamo Bay prisoners to this country. And you said the Guantanamo prisoners will be looked upon as jihadi rock stars. Each one could potentially produce 100 new ticking time bombs, ultimately walking the streets of America. FBI agents with whom I've spoken say that the transfer of prisoners to the U.S. is insane, pure and simple.
Well, John, the fact is that even though these, if in fact the prisoners from Guantanamo Bay are transferred, and even if they are locked up permanently, they still will have contact with the regular prison population, with both Muslims and non-Muslims. And given their jihadist beliefs and hardcore doctrine, it is almost guaranteed that they're going to serve as proselytizers and looked upon as I called rock stars in terms of conveying this jihadist ideology. Those other prisoners will ultimately be freed for whatever sentences they've been serving. And the problem is, once they're freed, then all hell can break loose, as we saw in the plot that broke out, that was disclosed last week. Because once they're out, then of course they're free to act upon their ideological extremism. And in the case in the Bronx plot, they wanted to blow up Jewish centers and shoot down a military plane because they were so angry at the U.S. We have seen lots of radical literature in prisons, and we have seen radical Islamic chaplains serving as advisors in prisons who also radicalize the prisoner population. This is a ticking time bomb, and we've seen it happen several times, like the plot in Riverside, California, several years ago when they interrupted a plot to blow up Jewish centers and a National Guard center. We've seen more than 25 U.S. prisoners released from prisons who have been involved ultimately in Islamic terrorist plots.
What about the argument, though, that these guys involved in this New York City plot recently, accused and arrested in this New York City plot, what about the argument that they are just sort of uneducated losers who got swept up into something by a government informant who was way too willing to spend money on them?
Well, look, radical Islamic groups, or those who are apologists for them, claim it's the informant who do the entrapment. But in fact, all the informant did was to provide the weapons that the defendants were prepared to use. In this case, C4 to blow up these synagogues and a Stinger missile to shoot down a plane. The reality is that when you look at any bunch of these terrorists, they look like losers. Look at the one who in 1993 retrieved his rental deposit after he tried to blow up the World Trade Center.
Yeah,
he looked like a loser. Back. But that was not a losing plot. They almost killed 100,000 people.
You mentioned that there's very little screening done of some of the people who try to recruit these people in prison. In 2004, you wrote, the way the Bureau of Prisons determined whether an imam was a radical was to simply ask them if they supported terrorism. If they said no, and of course they all did, they were granted admission. It would seem like the government has taken leave of its senses when it comes to deciding who to let in.
The Bureau of Prisons has acted so irresponsibly that it's beyond the scope of this interview to even detail. The head of the Bureau of Prisons, Susan Van Balen, she's now retired, used to speak at conferences that actually had credited chaplains. These conferences were sponsored by radical Islamic groups. She thought that they were fine. The Bureau of Prisons defined Wahhabism, that's the doctrine that governs the strict puritanical version of Islam in Saudi Arabia, as a symbol, basically a simple form of religious interpretation. Right. They never understood the problem of radical Islam. And that's the real scandal here.
Well, we can read more about it in your book, Jihad Incorporated. Steve Emerson, thank you.
You're welcome.
The world community's